Welcome, everybody, to this evening's programme with Social Rights Ireland and the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. This evening's title is called The Eagle Has Crash Landed. What a great title, and it's wonderful to have a guest on tonight, the Irish man Dara Cogley, Professor Dara Cogley, Professor of Sustainability and Economics, who is going to talk to us or come at this from the angle of the economic angle, really, to see what the impact is right now on the financial system, on the world economy. It happens to coincide also with the World Economic Forum. I think we were all watching that and absolutely appalled by what we were seeing with regard to Gaza. So we might go to Dr. Saeed Shaf for some analysis of the weekend. Then we're delighted to be joined by Tommy McKerney and Barry Murray of the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum, our panelists. And we have Stephen Roach here and Morgan O'Hear, who are becoming regular speakers on the show. So it's great to have you all here today. And without further ado, I'm going to call on Dara. Just introduce the discussion, and then we'll bounce around afterwards.
Thanks, Róisín. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone here. I've been listening in the last few weeks, so it's great to join you. I think with the WEF there that just happened in Davos, given everything that's happening around the world, there was, I guess, three things that stood out to me first and foremost. The one that got the most attention in the media was Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, his speech and his sort of announcement that the international rules-based order was a myth. It was a myth that was believed in sort of out of convenience, particularly by the Western nation. And he said it was sort of useful to have this myth in place, and that we're now in the middle of a rupture to that, a rupture in the world order. He used the words the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a harsh reality where power without limits or constraints is sort of the new guiding force on the planet. That combined with a huge trade deal that Canada did with China is a very significant shift away from US hegemony, and another very strong symbol that this sort of unipolar order that's existed since the fall of the Soviet Union is really at an end, and we're now entering this new era of sort of inter-imperialist rivalry and a more pluriversal global economy that's opening up. The next thing was this disgusting normalization of the Board of Peace, as it's being called. I think anything on the international level that has the word peace or humanitarian beside it now is really just the opposite. And this Board of Peace, we've seen it shift. It was called the Gaza Board of Peace, and now they've actually dropped the word Gaza, they've dropped mention of Palestine. And what we're seeing really now is that this Board of Peace is an attempt by Trump and his allies across the world to replace the international sort of so-called rules-based body, to replace any sort of checks on unrestrained US violence, and to replace the likes of the UN, the WHO, the International Courts of Justice, etc., with a new sort of partnership between really many of the most violent people on earth. So this sort of replacement with the Board of Peace, it comes after several different things where you still hear and heard the likes of Macron and other European leaders calling out for this rules-based order and justice and values, etc., despite them being fully complicit in the genocide in Palestine for the last few years, and also very much giving the green light to foreign intervention in Venezuela, in Iran, in Syria. There was this leaked text even from Macron to Trump about being fully aligned with their behavior, except for when it came to Greenland. And the third thing to me that really stood out was the interview of Scott Bessent, who's the United States Secretary of the Treasury. And he said, again, a few things that even the average liberal will not admit to. And what he really focused on was the collapse of the Iranian currency as something that the United States has been very deliberately targeting in order to collapse their economy and to encourage people to take to the street. And he says this is why the people took to the street. He said very explicitly, this is economic statecraft, no shots fired, things are moving in a very positive way here. So, with these sanctions that the US has put, and you can see the sort of mirror between Venezuela and Iran, where they essentially destroyed the entire economy through these illegal unilateral sanctions. And even with the word sanctions, I hear more and more people trying to get away from this language and referring to them instead as these violent coercive measures rather than sanctions, which sound somewhat more legitimate than what they really are. But what do we know about sanctions is actually they kill more people every year than does conflict. And this is something that's caused the death of, I think, over 40 million people just in the last maybe 50 years, close to a million people a year. And we see this sort of same strategy across the world. Any government that is in any way hostile to US interests will have to first face these sanctions. They'll attempt to essentially destroy the country from within. If that fails, they'll then attempt to go invade and destroy it in more overtly violent ways. So with Besant, so he is quite a significant figure, and his appointment was very much believed to be due to his expertise in currency. So he's quite well known in finance for in 1992, when he was the head of Soros Fund Management in London, he basically took down the British pound sterling in 92, and then he did the same to the Japanese yen in 2013, essentially betting against these currencies. And he's on record even in March saying he would advise betting against the Iranian rial, which is at this point now the lowest valued currency in the world, while in Venezuela they have the highest inflation in the world. So this goes to show really the power that the US does maintain through their loosening control of the global financial system. And this control over the global financial system, it's being exercised in such extreme and violent way that behind the scenes now for the last several years, their rivals, and in particular the likes of Russia, China, some of the BRICS countries, Iran, have been trying to essentially move away from US dollar hegemony and create their own alternative financial systems. And this is really the primary threat to the US empire as a whole today, as the power of the US empire over the last 50 years in particular has been due to their ability to essentially spend without needing to worry whatsoever about inflation, because they're the global reserve currency, because of the petrodollar agreement that they have had with Saudi Arabia since the 70s. They've essentially been able to spend at will, both domestically in terms of now being able to have $1 trillion or a $1.5 trillion military budget that Trump has just announced. It's allowed them to send hundreds of billions to Ukraine. It's allowed them to send hundreds of billions to Israel. It's allowed them to just bail out Argentina of $40 billion and run up a deficit that they don't really need to concern themselves with paying off. It allows them to essentially export their inflation to the global economy on the whole. And because of the dominance that they had over the financial system, they would then be able to lock out any other country from this system and essentially destroy their economy if they threatened US interests in the region. That's what we saw with Venezuela. It's what we're seeing with Iran. And whenever a country has really threatened to break this hegemony in the past, we saw with Iraq when they started selling oil in euro. We saw it in Libya when Gaddafi tried to implement an African currency, a Pan-African currency. Both of these leaders were immediately murdered by the United States. So it goes to show the emphasis really they put on their control over the financial system. And now with China, Russia, Iran, the BRICS countries, even including now Saudi Arabia and others starting to trade energy in currencies other than the US dollar, moving away from the SWIFT and implementing lots of other financial mechanisms that circumvent SWIFT, the US dollar, and move away from the petrodollar as a whole. The US is now really sort of shifting away from the soft power they've been able to maintain over the last 50 years plus. And we're seeing a shift now towards more hard power, where sort of overt violence and more direct colonialism are replacing what had been sort of this neo-colonial financialized mechanisms of the past 50 years or so.
Thank you very much, Dara, for giving that overview and the importance of the petrodollar. I think it's important also to mention your article. I know you write for Counterpunch, so we'll share that as well in the chat. I might ask Stephen to, if you could put that into the chat, Stephen, that would be great. I'm going to go over now to Saib because Dara has focused obviously on US imperialism and its dominance through the financial hegemony over the world. But as we know, Palestine, with Iran, with Syria, with this part of the Middle East, it's geopolitically very, very important, not only for oil. So why else, in your view, is this particular area, just for those who maybe even last week we looked at Iran and why it's strategically important to the Zionist empire, but to US imperialism as well. And then maybe you would give us, if you've been following Davos, Saib, maybe some insights into your analysis and your take on what's happened over the weekend.
I try to break it into just 3 points. First, I want to put the briefest definition of imperialism that I can come up with. To me, imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. So it's monopoly stage of capitalism. That's when you see imperialism emerge from a development through the displacement of capitalist free competition by capitalist monopoly taking its place. So capitalist imperialism is free competition is the basic feature of capitalism, and commodity production generally. Then you can see monopoly is the exact opposite of a free competition. So I'm saying that because today is the crashing empire see itself in competition with people who is genuinely try to compete in the market, like the Chinese, and they cannot compete, so they resort to their military assets, which nobody can dispute. They have the best military assets around. So from that, you can see competition transferred into exact opposite monopolies, resulting into concentration of production and capital to the point where we can see everything is growing out of monopoly, like the financial syndicates, the cartels, and the trusts, and all of that. And they become the sort of the multinationals who are leading the empire. Today, the imperialist capitalist system, which is turning into imperialist fascism, we see it in action. This is bring us back to something we used to call it, and still called, the unipolar moment. This happened when we see people like Gorbachev at the time, was busy putting in place his liberal Russian recruits like Yeltsin, and they are both busy with their entourage in dismantling the USSR, the Soviet Union, from within, because a lot of people have misinformation that the Cold War and the pressures from outside help in dismantling the Soviet Union. It didn't. It collapsed from within inside. People like Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and them, people who helped immensely achieving that. So after that, you can see the Western neoliberalists, led by Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher at the time, they acknowledge and believe they won the Cold War, and they acted accordingly. So that's when they knew they are now ideologically, culturally, militarily, economically, and financially dominating the world. The economic engines of the whole world empire, which is the United States of America and the Western elites, is led by Zionist-controlled entourage. I don't want to, for many historical reasons, since they were always controlling the banks. So I want to shift from here to the Prime Minister of Canada, Carney, said, people think it's the best speech maybe they had this year or something. Canada signed, as my comrade said, a strategic trade agreement with China. To me, always I ask the question, would that take place without the US deep state approval as well? Just pay attention to what Carney himself said. I want to read a little bit from it. He says, hegemon using economic integration as weapon, tariff as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion. International supply chains are vulnerable to be exploited. But he says, when we negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what offered, and we compete with each other to be the most accommodating. And this is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. Then he says, we have something too, the capacity to stop pretending, to name reality, to build our strength at home, and to act together. All what he said, you think a politician from the global south is talking. You think a politician of Egypt president or Nigeria president or somebody is talking. But now they see this crashing empire is eating its own. They felt danger, and they start acting as they are what they like to call the global south, a third world countries. But again, with all of his Carney's speech, or even Macron, or even Starmer, do anything or say anything without approval from the deep state. We understand Trump he presented himself when he was elected the first time in the United States of America, the first term, anti-deep state. And lately, we can see he's become very close to the neocons, which he's supposed to be, like declaring himself against the neocons. You have his foreign minister, which is leading the campaign against Venezuela, Latin America, is controlling all the foreign policy of the United States, is a neocon. And you can see the United States of America, how it's sidelines its own allies. The UK, which is historically America's most loyal partner, it treated as disposable. The same with all the EU. And the problems which is the United States of America is facing today, it's huge with these kind of destabilized kind of relationship with the Europeans, the major allies, specifically in Greenland, which is part of Norway. Norway is a member of the NATO. Now the NATO is want to defend Greenland or obey the hegemon of the United States of America. Of course, they're going to obey the hegemon. They cannot do anything else except adhere to this madman who leading a mad kind of a country who cannot compete with the international community in any level. It's need to loot resources to stay as number one in the world affair, to lengthen or prolong the unipolar moment in history while it's crashing. And that's why we've seen it is going and swallowing Venezuela, going in there. It's not just the oil, as said, because Venezuela trade with China with the dollar. So they want to take that trade and again sell it in dollar to strengthen the weakened dollar, who is destroying the economy and stagnating it in the United States of America. And the same thing going to Iran to limit the access of the Chinese to the Iranian energy, even by prolonging the conflict in there, because the United States of America, I believe, won't put boots in the ground in Iran. Iran is a humongous country, which is 10 times stronger than any country around it. The Vietnam will be for the Americans as a picnic compared to Iran. They understand that very well, but at the same time, the geopolitics of that, they can control the energy market. This is what the United States of America is trying to do, trying to control the logistics, the routes, the waterways, the resources, and the whole thing. At the same time, deny any competitor like the Chinese or any other country, even EU, from accessing, as long as the United States of America can allow that in what can benefit the United States of America. This is, you can see how the United States of America going to a low level of manufacturing stories to justify military campaigns or economic pressures for destabilizing or intervention in countries and their resources, like accusing Nigeria of genocide against Christian and bombarding Nigeria, accusing South Africa because it took a case in the Hague against the Zionist entities genociding Gaza, accusing them of genocide, the act of disrespecting any country's sovereignty, like what they done in Venezuela. They kidnapped the elected president, and so many things. You can see how they support terror gangs in Sudan and destabilizing Sudan, how they can support the Zionist entity in recognizing a breakaway province from Somalia and causing more havoc in Africa. This as well involve partnership in genocide in Gaza. This is supposed to be the leader of the free world. So we are witnessing now the collapse of this morally and culturally, who used to dominate the world ideologically, militarily, economically. The whole thing is in collapse. So there is moments when you see an empire in decline. It's dangerous, and it's dangerous to this its own. As I said, it might eat its own. Again, I want to repeat, and I hope I'll say it right this time. Henry Kissinger, one of the monsters of the realist politics in the United States of America, used to say, to be a friend, to be an enemy of the United States of America is dangerous. To be a friend of the United States of America is fatal. And that, I think, summarizes this. Regarding Davos, I agree with my comrade. The way when they gathered the leaders in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt to reach this, what they call it, the peace board, and Trump put himself the head of it, and it's regarding to stop the genocide in Gaza. People of the world, especially in the global south, were so excited because they want to see an end to the genocide going in Gaza, which financed by the Western imperialist forces led by the United States of America. And that was used as well to do two things: to try to put the United States of America's ownership on the Gaza Strip, and to justify as well what the Zionist entity did before. When we saw the man speaking in Davos to the world like he is headmaster of this school, and he's speaking to a student and insulting them. And at the same time, when he speaks of economical figures, 70% of what he said were lies, and you cannot verify one figure he gave in there about the economy of the United States of America or about anything. And then they tried, because to put these places, these committees like the Board of Peace, and asking as well after that, any country want to join this board, to have the honor to be on the board with Trump, to pay $1 billion just to have a seat in there without saying anything. The whole thing stemmed from the time when the Zionist entity told lies, and all European countries, the United States of America as well, from the time of genocide Joe Biden, they agreed with them, said there is 7 employees from UNRWA, United Nations agency, were members of the Hamas who infiltrated on the 7th of October the Zionist entity. And suddenly UNRWA, which is supporting the Palestinian refugee, and this was done by United Nations resolution, which is give UNRWA its mandate to look after refugees in Palestine. Didn't say Palestinian refugees. Refugees in Palestine at that time covers Jewish who came from Europe and the Palestinian refugees who displaced by the Zionist entity within Palestine. And that is to enable these people, according to a resolution of United Nations Security Council 194, the Palestinian people, to help them and to look after them till they be able to return home to their homes, cities, towns, and villages. The Israelis see UNRWA is endangering the existence of the Zionist entity because it's empowering the Palestinians to demand the right of return according to the international community's resolution of the United Nations. By destroying UNRWA and replacing UNRWA by other organizations, we saw what the Americans did when they brought what they call it the Humanitarian Foundation of Gaza, and the killing fields it did in Gaza, the concentration camps it did in Gaza for the starving people. You'll see hundreds of people going there, starved for days by the Zionist entity. Once they arrived to the American center in there, this was exposed by their own soldiers after they left Gaza, and they start shooting at women, at men, and killing so many of them. This has failed. The United States of America now wanted another body to replace the whole United Nations, because as my comrade was saying, they don't. Trump in his first administration, he pulled out of the protocols of the global warming, I think in the Paris protocols, and he pulled out of the JCPOA agreement, which is United Nations resolution was supported to deal with Iran and the Iranian civil nuclear program, and so many things. So today, the international orders, as we know, doesn't exist. Trump installed himself as king of the world because he knows the military capacity of the United States of America is #1 in the world. And he doesn't want to entertain anything but the strength and power of the United States of America. And through using that, he can turn and transfer the example of Gaza to expand it now from the peace port for Gaza to cover Syria, Lebanon, now Iran, and suddenly the globe. And in that way, there is only one veto in that, which is belong to Trump himself. This is Trump's moment in history. Before we're speaking about the unipolar moment of the United States of America, ranking with power. Now, Trump trying to create chaos. From that chaos, he wants to extract an opportunity. That opportunity by power, by bullying, by destruction, United States of America has to stay the hegemon.
Yeah, thanks very much, Saeed, covering a lot of ground there and going in. Maybe I asked too broad of a question of you, but you managed to cover a lot of that. I'm going to go over now to Comrade Tommy McKerney. Tommy, I'd love if you could respond to Dara's introduction there, where he talked about the economic hegemony of and that side of US imperialism, and to hear your take on Dara's analysis. And also, if there's time, Saeed mentioned Greenland there. Can we take that seriously at all? Don't want to make it too big, Tommy, because I know that the clock is ticking, but your contribution, please.
Thanks. I thought Darren's explanation and talk on the petrodollar was excellent. It's one of the means by which the United States exercised its dominance for decades. However, at the moment, the petrodollar is under pressure for a number of reasons, partly because the United States economy is not performing nearly as well as it used to, partly because, or largely because, as a result of neoliberalism and capitalist greed, it exported its manufacturing capacity for cheaper labor, cheaper costs, to the extent that it lost a lot of its manufacturing base. Now it's continuing to exercise a certain amount of economic control through its IT sector, but I mean that's also being challenged day and daily by the Chinese, who are finding that the world is finding that the Chinese technology is on a par with the United States. So how long the United States will hold the lead there? The fact then means that the petrodollar that America has used to finance its expansionism, it's financed its home budgets through the petrodollar because it could print the dollar. The dollar was used internationally to settle debts. That it's now becoming a question that the dollar is not nearly as solid as it had been for years, to such an extent that very recently gold has went to the extraordinary price of $5,000 per ounce. Now that's a signal that people are no longer trusting currencies, that their traders are putting their faith in hard metal. The fact then becomes that as the petrodollar falls, the United States is finding it's difficult to sustain its economic position. The fact is, so gold is an indicator. It's an indication that what used to be seen, the dollar was seen as good as gold to be effectively, but now no longer. And the fact then becomes that other traders, countries, central banks are no longer stocking the dollar, hedging their bets. They're moving it to other currencies and gold. As well as that, the Chinese and other countries are now using alternatives to the dollar. Now, at the moment, other alternative currencies do not have the same strength as the dollar, but they have an alternative that wasn't there for years, for decades. With that American economy, the American is falling. China has arguably at least calculated either the first largest economy in the world or the second largest economy to the United States. But significantly, the difference is that the Chinese are a manufacturing country, whereas the United States is no longer quite leading country in manufacturing. And ultimately, the United States, its GDP is largely dependent to a large extent on finance, which is two things that a limited number of percentage of the population can exist through finance, because we're seeing, for example, what's known as the Rust Belt, where large numbers of where there used to be well-paid manual labouring jobs are no longer exist, to an extent that has given a rise to the MAGA movement of Make America Great Again. Some of those behind Donald Trump, his theorists have advocated restoring the manufacturing base in the United States through tariffs, but it's not really a successful strategy. It's open to economic challenge rather than for the United States to restore its manufacturing base would require actually a centrally planned economy, which is not compatible with the American US capitalist model of production. So as the US economy is in decline, and ultimately history teaches us that power comes from the economy. And the economy depends not on financial whiz-kiddery, but on manufacturing. So as that then, that's what has led to the situation that Dr. Saib so eloquently laid out, the resort to violent practices. The United States is now becoming more militarized, as has happened in the past with other empires failing, the resort to military resources to offset their economic hegemony that they have exercised for centuries or for decades. And the thing then becomes one of exercising military power as a substitute for their economic dominance. I'm very afraid that what's happening is that there's some elements here of what happened in the 1930s when Spain, military coup, overthrew the democratically elected Republican government in Spain. The world, with the exception of the Soviet Union and Mexico, stood back and allowed, in fact, encouraged the Nazis and the fascists in Italy to support the Phalangists in Spain. The world stood back and let it happen. Not only let it happen, but blockaded the Spanish Republic, which encouraged Hitler then to launch a war. And it wasn't Hitler. Actually, it was Hitler, of course, was the front for Nazi Germany. I'm very afraid that what's happening in Gaza at the moment, when the world stands back and allows the Palestinian people to be slaughtered in a genocidal attack, that's encouraging the militarists in the United States to believe that they can prop up their power base through military means.
Thank you, Tommy. Yeah, thanks. A good response there to both Dara and Saeed and linking them together. I know that Morgan and Stephen are here as well, and I think they're interested in engaging more in a conversation. And maybe at this point we might bring Morgan in. Morgan, you spoke about Iran in the last 2 weeks very cogently and brought us an awful lot of insights into the reality of what's going on, juxtaposed with Western propaganda to sort of create clarity. But moving from Iran, and we're even, when we're looking at the proxies, somebody mentioned actually in the chat, what we see even on the streets being organised in Dublin is now rallies for Kurdistan, to support Kurdistan. And it just goes to show you that while we are producing content like this for clarity, there still is a cohort who exist in another world that seems to follow the Western imperialist narrative, despite all the awareness that this is propaganda that is favouring Western US imperialist interests. Morgan, would you like to come in perhaps with any observations or questions for Dara?
Well, yeah, thanks, Dara, for coming along tonight. Yeah, I'd love to draw you out further because I know you'd have a good knowledge in the topic of discussion this evening. I was kind of would be interested in your thoughts on my own sort of understanding or analysis of the current financial system and how it dominates the political system that we live in. How, particularly in the imperial core, which would be Washington, how the essential billionaires and the monopolists in the US managed to coalesce quite clearly around the last two winning candidates in the States. It could be argued that the first Trump administration was not in the interest of the monopolists and the industry leaders, because he would have been considered a less safe bet in terms of how to get away with exactly what they wanted to do. Obviously, he's been entirely brought on board in the second administration. It was no fluke that he won so easily in 2024, given that the monopolists and the essential billionaires coalesced around Trump, and the DNC effectively didn't lift a finger to win the election. They had an appalling candidate who ran an appalling campaign, and they carried out crimes in the last 12 months in particular of their administration that you could only realistically rationally put down to getting as much done as possible with a spent brand, which is what I think the Trump administration is currently engaged in themselves now, seeing as their favorability has just nosedived and they've just gotten more violent in how they lash out. And that is ultimately the financial system behind them guiding the administration's decisions. And realism is rational. To be rational is to be real. But when the capitalist and political establishment take up irrationalism, it is always a rational choice. I put it down to the crisis of political decisions in the West at the moment, down to a rational decision to be irrational and lash out and take gambles in the wider scheme of things. I'd be interested in particular to kind of ask you, Dara, about the shifting emphasis. So recently in Davos, the primary issue for the political establishment seemed to pivot from climate to AI, because I think they recognize in particular that the growth in climate industry, I guess you call it, is too slow, that they can't make as much profit and continue the financial system at its current pace, whilst putting emphasis on that. And so they shifted to AI in order to sort of maintain their financial strength. Because if you take away AI in the last 24 months, there's been effectively no growth in Washington in terms of their economy. Obviously, AI as well, it's in order to do it, you're kind of destroying what the perceived focus on, your perceived focus on climate, because it's obviously, required a lot of energy, and a lot of energy that is not necessarily clean, that takes away from human needs. What do you think yourself on where the emphasis is moving, why it's going there? And I suppose just I'm keen to hear more of what you have to say.
Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, it's a great question. And it's in my opinion anyway, a mixture of a few different things kind of happening at the same time. Firstly, in terms of kind of what you're saying with chaos, but there being rationality within the chaos, I completely agree with. And chaos is very much used to push through a lot of things behind the chaos that would otherwise be very controversial. When it comes to sort of the purpose of Trump right now and sort of what he is being very much used for, I think the first thing that sort of came to mind, I guess, was the fact that he is very much controlled and also compromised by way of the Epstein files. And this is something I think that is often left out of analysis, that Epstein was a known collaborator with Mossad and the CIA and has very deep links to the Israeli and the US deep state. So in that sense, despite his unpredictability, he is controlled at the same time. Then when it comes to sort of other sort of macro trends that are happening behind the scenes, what do we see in terms of climate is when you actually look into climate change or environmental breakdown, what all of the scientific papers will say is that the primary cause of environmental breakdown or climate change is something called ecological overshoot, which is essentially the contradiction between the growth paradigm under capitalism, as in the necessity for perpetual expansion on a planet with finite resources. In order for capitalism to survive, it essentially needs to double in size more or less every 20 years. When you look at the correlation between GDP on a global scale and energy consumption as well as material footprint, they're 1-to-1. So every 1% growth in GDP, you get a 1% growth in energy, you get a 1% growth in material consumption. What does that mean is that once you project even a decade or two into the future, you run into collapse of some sort, regardless of who's at the helm. At the same time, back to the monetary system, is that the global monetary system, 97% of money is actually created through debt. That being money is created when banks give out loans. Loans are created out of thin air with interest, meaning there's always more interest than there is money in the world. And once you start reducing debt, you start reducing money supply and you run into recession. So the two things that really dictate the global economy are oil prices and the level of debt. And what drives these sort of boom bust cycles is really debt driving the positive side of the cycle, becoming unsustainable, default and collapse. So you have now the sort of two-pronged major collapses of the monetary system, as well as extreme weather events, resource scarcity, and more, which dictate that the capitalist economy sooner or later will have to collapse. What you have in Trump compared to, say, with the Democrats, I can't remember the name of the guy who I saw this video of, but he was describing the election as sort of between the sort of monarchists and the corporatists, as between the Republicans and Democrats, essentially. As in, the Democrats look more for stability and the conditions favorable to do business within, whether what Trump represents is sort of how do we get control of all of the choke points and the necessities for life. So that being farmland, that being trade routes, that being energy, that being gold, resources, minerals. And the three sort of industries really that have most control over Trump and are being most served by Trump would be the energy companies, obviously, who seem to be very much leading the charge on Venezuela and also Iran. And you saw like the share prices for Chevron instantly go up maybe 10% the day after they kidnapped Maduro. You have the technology companies, obviously. It was really the tech billionaires that accompanied Trump on stage at his inauguration. And they also, of course, require a huge amount of energy. They also require a huge amount of rare earth minerals. And they're deeply now embedded into the military industrial complex, which is sort of the third prong of the sort of unholy trinity that would be very much leading a lot of US foreign policy. So what you're seeing now in terms of kind of the links, I mean, the genocide really exposed the centrality of the technology industry within the military industrial complex. And particularly in Ireland, you saw the vast majority of sort of our own complicity at home was through the tech companies that exist in Ireland. And if you see how climate policy is being done in Ireland, it's this sort of dual strategy of digitization, AI on one side with climate, which really should be two things that are completely antagonistic to the other. Yes, they're being grouped in because of the sort of eco-modernist brainwashing that's really happened as a way to sort of fix the climate crisis through technical solutions rather than what has to be done, but nobody wants to admit, is to completely transform our economic system away from capitalism. So with the United States, what happened in the years prior to the second Trump term, the biggest thing was really the failure of the United States to defeat Russia through cutting Russia off from the global financial system. So they assumed that cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system and using the sort of sanctions approach and sending God knows how much to Ukraine, that they would be able to destroy the Russian economy. But what did that actually do is open up several different very important back channels between Russia, China, the BRICS countries, Venezuela, Iran, and all of the sort of countries which felt that they could next be targeted by US sanctions and financial exclusion. And that was really the beginning of the end of the US's primary soft power, which is the US dollar. So what did that require was a shift in strategy from the United States away from what has historically served them and towards their sort of trump card, you could say, and that is outright militarization. And once you have that amidst the chaos that they're deliberately creating, both at home and internationally. And I think that's what a lot of the rhetoric about Greenland or Canada are actually about, is essentially sowing the conditions for dictatorship. Because once you have a certain amount of chaos, sustainability goes out the window. That's already happened. If you look at the European Union, they had talked about sustainability for decades, the Green Deal, all of these regulations. They went out the window once there was any threat of conflicts. And it's the same thing really that's happening now on a global scale and also within the United States as a whole, is once you have serious threat of conflict, you don't have to abide by any of the sort of democratic protocols or the checks and balances that would typically restrain corporate power in a normal country. So I think for me, that's sort of how I understood that general process that's resulted in where we are now.
Thank you, Dara. Morgan, would you like to come in? Stephen, I'm going to also call on you as well, just to wrap up before we do Q&A. I don't know if you can hear us, Stephen? If not, Morgan.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I'm in
Brilliant,
my
Stephen.
car, so I'm on the
Sure.
driving mode.
Morgan, we'll go to you first, maybe. Are you satisfied with that response from Dara? How do you feel about the take on even how AI and, like you mentioned, the how climate policy seems to be created and manufactured to facilitate nearly these big industries?
Well, I suppose the climate industry and the projections from, how they could make more money from it over the long term. I think that was in the interest of these, I suppose, the leading billionaires and the industry leaders. What's happened in the last couple of years is a severe crisis of capitalism where they need returns immediately in order to keep the show on the road. And obviously, I think that's where this obvious AI bubble has come from, and why it is being sustained and why it is being pursued to the ends that it is right now. When the AI bubble does pop, and it has to eventually, it will do untold damage unless they can make major gains, I suppose, internationally over the coming years. And I think they've kind of speed run through a couple of their methods of doing so. So obviously, with the war in Ukraine as well, a key part of that is how the West, Washington and London were essential in creating the conditions for the war to happen. How they, in particular, Washington wanted and have succeeded in doing so, have cut off the EU from Russian energy, which was very, very cheap, much cleaner than what has supplanted it, which is American LNG. I think they're getting more energy from other sources as well, but it's more expensive and it's not as convenient as, I suppose, Russian supplies. That has obviously expanded the hegemonic power in Washington. And this is, speaks to something Saeed was talking about earlier, like inter-imperialist rivalry, where I suppose Washington as the hegemonic power has expanded its influence over the European imperialist nations and is eating into them in its own imperial decline in order, again, to keep the show on the road. It's hard to know where it's all going. This is what happens when you endlessly print dollars, essentially devalue the currency. Obviously, I think Tommy mentioned earlier, gold over $5,000, silver over $100. Precious metals have tripled in value in the last 4 or 5 years. This is it's a major crisis. And it's only occurred twice in the last 100 years, and it's both led to world wars. So, as I say, it's not rational to push towards militarism and war, but if you understand, I suppose, the capitalist system and just where in the process we are, it is quite rational and predictable. That's why we need to try and understand it as best we can, and it's why hearing more from people like you, Dara, that I think we can educate people. So I hope you come back as well. If you have any thoughts on what I've said, please do expand, because I'd love to make this a conversation again.
Thanks, Morgan. Before maybe you do, Dara, and we'll give you maybe the last closing lines. Stephen, if you'd like to come in, because I know that you've read quite a bit of Dara's work and you're interested in this whole area of the world economy. Do you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, thanks, Róisín. Very, very interesting discussion. Thank you, Dara. Thank you, everybody. So many questions are firing off in my mind. Kind of the overriding one is, as you describe it, Dara, the US economy has essentially devolved into a kind of Ponzi scheme, one that's maintained by force of arms, but like all Ponzi schemes, is doomed eventually to fall apart, to collapse. So my question would be, is there any room for optimism that there could be a wind down, or is this behemoth just heading straight for a massive crash that will bring probably the world down in flames with it? I mean, is there any, if we were to get a new leadership in the United States, let's say more managerial one, a Mark Carney type leader, or an Obama, somebody who's more emotionally and psychologically stable than the current junta, is there any way that they could reverse the momentum of the last 50 years since they abandoned the gold standard and have essentially turned their economy into a Ponzi scheme? So that's kind of the big question. Also, the role of debt, because in addition to leveraging its military power to print dollars in the safe knowledge that they won't lose value,
the United States also obviously has taken out an awful lot of debt. So I'd be interested to know your thoughts on the role of that. And then another little, just a side point, is kind of a smaller, maybe easier to answer question. When I was reading your piece in Counterpunch, just something that came to mind was when you were talking about this secret deal that was done with the Saudis, that they would trade exclusively in dollars. Whatever happened to OPEC? Because obviously OPEC was crucial in the oil embargo of 1973. But OPEC seems to have completely receded into the shadows. And even in the context of Venezuela, which is obviously an OPEC member, I heard no mention or really anywhere of what this signified for OPEC. Iran obviously is a member too, but so is Saudi Arabia, Iraq. Is OPEC kind of dead in the water? Is it just a relic? Is it a skeleton kind of zombie institution? Or is there a possibility that it could again regain power and play a role in the de-dollarization of the oil trade? Thanks.
So yeah, basically, so on the first part, in terms of like, is there hope, or what is there to sort of hope for in terms of the US empire? I think like the sort of hope for humanity has to be in the fall of the US empire. And I think as long as the US empire exists in its current form, even if you were to look exclusively just through the environmental lens, is that the track that the US empire has humanity headed towards is extinction. That's the reality. When it comes to just looking at climate science alone, this year we officially passed 1.5 degrees, the tipping point that we were supposedly meant to avoid based on the Paris Agreement signed only 10 years ago. We're meant to pass 2 degrees in the next 15 years, and there are some of the world's top climate scientists, including James Hansen, who was the first climate scientist to testify to NASA or to Congress in the 1980s. He says that even based on what we've already emitted, the Earth heats towards 10 degrees, by which point we'd be long gone. So we need to do a huge amount of work in order to try and sequester just the existing carbon that's in the atmosphere already. And as long as the capitalist system exists, which is built on perpetual expansion, extraction, and inequality, we can never do that. What has to be hoped for is the collapse of the US empire. Now, the question is what do they take down with them? And what does that collapse actually look like? When we look at the general behavior of the United States throughout its whole history, it's built on violence from its first day until today. And it's hard to see a way that the United States falls without subjecting the entire world to that violence, especially when you consider that they have 800 military bases around the world. They now have a $1.5 trillion military budget. They have nuclear weapons. And even internally now, they have an internal army in ICE that's increasingly resembling the Gestapo. So when you look at these things, it's hard to see an end that isn't incredibly violent, but at the same time, an end is now increasingly seeming like an inevitability and a when rather than an if. The issue is to what happens to this empire and how it actually falls. So when you look at it through the monetary lens and through their debt, they now have a 35 trillion debt that they will never be able to repay. And as I said, there's more debt in the world than money. Like, just that contradiction alone should tell you all you need to know about this debt. So when it comes to this, I mean, part of the way that unsustainable debt will typically be paid off by a country is through inflation, as a way essentially to sort of reduce the value of the debt through a devaluing of the currency itself. And this will start to occur more and more now as the rest of the global economy moves away from the US dollar, and the dollar sort of loses the privilege that it's had in the global economy as a whole. And with this, and with the sort of seeming end of the petrodollar agreement as a whole, so now you see the BRICS countries, actually their GDP in purchasing parity is more valuable than the G7 nowadays. the 5 countries of BRICS are now have a higher economic output in purchasing power than the G7. So this shift has already happened. And when you see what's happening in terms of global trade, and you see even the sort of strategies that countries are employing. I heard in one of the last podcasts actually on here, maybe it was Saeb talking about Samir Amin, and this sort of approach of delinking was one of the primary strategies, essentially of sort of trying to starve the empire and pursue a sovereignty that actually prioritizes the well-being of the citizens of your own countries and allows you to develop in a way that's as independent of empire as possible. And I think with the Trump tariffs, as a way to try and reindustrialize the United States to a certain extent, because they obviously spotted the weak point of having a financialized economy when they're sort of having to deal potentially in war with the likes of China or Russia, who are both heavily industrialized economies. So with that, countries have now also started to delink their economies away from the United States and to take this idea of sovereignty more seriously, because there was a long held sort of illusion, I think, among many countries that provided that you were an ally of the United States, you were safe. But I think Tommy's quote on, or quoting Kissinger on sort of being a friend of the United States is fatal, is now a good representation of the reality of this sort of abusive relationship, I think, that most countries have discovered they truly have with the United States. So in terms of like a potential sort of less violent ending for that, I think it has to be pursued through countries pursuing strategies of meaningful sovereignty in terms of developing food sovereignty, financial, monetary sovereignty, economic sovereignty away from the empire. And what you're also starting to see more and more so now is unrest within the United States. And as Saab said about the Soviet Union, the reason the Soviet Union fell without really any bullets fired was the fact that the collapse came from within. And within the United States now, there's significant portion of the population that have watched the mask fall off the United States government and to see it for what it really is. And they understand now, a lot of them do, regardless of if it's Democrat or Republican or if it's Obama or Trump, it's the same interests and it's the same system with more or less the same outcomes. And they now have a government of outed pedophiles. And this, like, I sound like, sometimes I hear myself saying this and I'm like, God, do I sound like a kind of crazy person? But it's the reality. Just the reality is crazy. But it's confirmed that Gustav Petro referred to the United States government as a clan of pedophiles. And I think that is a good representation. And they're being controlled by foreign interests in Israel. This is also reality. And these leaders are bringing us towards an extinction level event without any concern for the citizens of their own country. So this whole rhetoric over America first is also being proven to be an absolute lie. And now when you look at what's happening on the streets of Minneapolis and also around the country, and we have to remember that the US is the most militarized society in the history of humanity. I think there's more guns than people in that country. So when you mix these things together, you get the potential for significant revolutionary potential within the country as a whole. Now, what that revolution could look like right now, it looks like it would be far more reactionary than it would be progressive. But at least there are sort of seeds of dissent within the country that could make the fall of the empire at least less destructive on a global scale. But with these things, there's so many complexities and so many sort of cycles and macro trends all sort of folding into each other at the same time that the direction of it is very difficult to predict, because one, depending on sort of which of the dominoes falls first, it could go in any direction, really.
Good grief. On that frightening note, Dara, we will close. But before we do, I'd like to thank you very much, Dara Cogley, for a fantastic introduction and the responses, as well to our panelists, Tommy McKerney, to Saib. Again, thank you as always, Saib, for that very broad perspective and always bringing it back to Palestine. To Morgan as well for engaging, Morgan O'Keirda, who's in Cork, and Stephen Roach, who is in Galway. Thank you all very much, and we do hope to have you back, Dara.